Way back in 1987, a huge UN report dropped, and it told a hidden story. A story of how the entire global economy was basically underwriting the destruction of our planet. It uncovered this vicious cycle that connects debt, poverty, and environmental ruin. And that's the powerful connection we're digging into today. If you remember the 1980s, the headlines were just shocking. You had these massive industrial accidents and heart-wrenching natural disasters that became symbols of a world in crisis. Bhopal, Chernobyl, the awful famine in Africa. These things grabbed the world's attention, but they all felt like separate, isolated tragedies. But underneath all that noise, the authors of this groundbreaking report, Our Common Future, started to see a different pattern. They traveled to 5 different continents, and they discovered this deeper, more systemic crisis, a kind of downward spiral that was linking poverty, international debt, and the health of the ecosystems that, well, we all depend on. And this quote right here, man, it gets to the heart of the dilemma they found. What's so wild about this is the framing. They're not just talking about pollution or saving animals, they're talking about finance. It completely reframes environmental destruction as a kind of debt. Like we're taking out a massive loan from the future, and we're leaving our kids to pay the bill. So that brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. How on earth did the machinery of international finance, debt, trade, you name it, create a system that pretty much forces nations to sell off their natural wealth just to keep their heads above water? The report calls this the vicious cycle, and it really is. It's this loop that just keeps feeding itself, where the economic pressure on the world's poorest countries directly fuels ecological collapse, which in turn just makes them even poorer. It's a trap. Okay, so how does this trap actually work? Well, it all starts with massive, crushing international debt. Now, to make the interest payments on that debt, countries desperately need foreign currency. And what's the quickest way to get it? You guessed it. You start exporting your natural resources on a massive scale. Timber, minerals, you name it. This leads to overexploitation, which destroys the very environmental foundation of your economy. And the result isn't wealth, it's even deeper poverty, which of course just kicks the cycle off all over again. So what lit the fuse on this whole spiral? The report points to what was basically a perfect economic storm. Global prices for raw materials just collapsed, which meant nations had to sell more and more stuff just to earn the same amount of cash. At the exact same time, international interest rates shot through the roof, making their debts just explode. And to top it all off, aid and new loans just dried up, leaving them with almost no other options. All right, so that's the theory. Let's look at how this cycle became a devastating reality. The Our Common Future report showed exactly how this financial pressure forced entire continents to basically pay their foreign bills with their natural capital. Just get a load of this number. In one single year, 1984, the 7 biggest debtor nations in Latin America sent a net total of almost $39 billion out of their economies and into the pockets of foreign creditors. This was a massive drain of resources. We're talking about a third of their total domestic savings. Now just think for a second about what that money could have done. It could have built hospitals, schools, infrastructure. It could have made sure people had enough to eat. But instead, this debt crisis forced them into severe austerity. Wealth that should have been building a future was instead being used just to service foreign loans. To put it bluntly, development itself was being sacrificed. And the report shows the exact same pattern playing out in Africa, but with consequences that were, frankly, even more tragic. Unpayable debts forced nations to overfarm their delicate soils, which sped up the process of desertification. And at the same time, protectionist trade barriers in rich countries meant they couldn't even get a fair price for their agricultural goods. The report didn't mince words. The global economic system was taking more from the poor continent than it was giving. So the debt crisis was the main engine driving this destruction. But there were other things going on in the global economy. Let's call them accelerants that were like pouring gasoline on the fire and making that vicious cycle spin even faster. A huge issue was something called the terms of trade. You can see the imbalance right here. Developing countries had to export a higher and higher volume of raw materials just to afford the same amount of imported manufactured goods. I mean, they were running faster and faster just to stay in the same place, and the environmental cost of that frantic pace was just enormous. And who was really benefiting from this lopsided system? This is just staggering. For all these key commodities, we're talking about 80 to 90% of the entire global trade being controlled by just a tiny handful of transnational corporations. That is an insane concentration of market power. And that power imbalance was absolutely critical. I mean, picture it, a small, poor nation trying to negotiate with a massive global corporation. It's not a negotiation between equals, right? They were often forced to accept deals like short-term logging contracts that were just disastrous for their own long-term well-being. But here's the thing. The report wasn't all doom and gloom. It was called Our Common Future for a reason. It actually offered a powerful vision for a different path forward, a way to actually break this destructive cycle. And the key to that path was this then new idea, sustainable development, which was famously defined right here in this report. Now, this wasn't about stopping economic growth, not at all. It was about changing the quality of that growth. It was a call to create an economic system that could lift people out of poverty today without totally bankrupting the planet for tomorrow. So the recommendations were crystal clear and systemic. If you want to break the cycle, you have to go after its root causes. You have to alleviate the debt that's forcing this overexploitation. You have to make trade fair. You have to focus aid on projects that are actually sustainable. And crucially, you have to stop treating the economy and the environment as two separate things. And finally, you have to help developing nations get stronger so they can negotiate as equals on the world stage. So this report laid out the problem and the solution with stunning clarity. And that was over 3 decades ago. It showed that protecting the environment isn't some luxury, but it's an absolute precondition for any kind of lasting economic prosperity. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question for today, doesn't it? Have we actually heeded that warning, or are we still borrowing from a future that can't afford our debts?